Hi, I'm Izzy Conn and welcome back to Leading Labour. We took a break last week, but now I'm so happy to be back with this episode on John Smith. For the last year, I've been interviewing senior insiders and experts to understand the stories of each of the post-war Labour leaders. The episodes all look at the same themes. They look at how each leader responded to major political developments, how they managed the ever-present tension between the left and right of the Labour Party, and overall how the leaders tried to win elections and bring Labour into government. John Smith was the leader of the party from 1992 until 1994. But let's start by looking at the beginning of his life. He was born in September 1938 in Dalmally in Scotland. I spoke to Colm Murphy about John Smith. He's a lecturer in British politics at Queen Mary University, London, and is author of Futures of Socialism, Modernisation, the Labour Party and the British Left, 1973 to 1997.
In terms of early formation, his father was a teacher, and I think they would get the New Statesman delivered by boat to this rural Scottish location. So I think he was raised in a sort of Fabian environment in that sense. He was a big supporter of comprehensive education and a big opponent of private school education, I think partly because of his family professional background.
Smith went to Glasgow University, graduating with an MA in history before studying law there too.
At the University of Glasgow, he got involved with the local Labour club, as many Labour politicians do, and that was strongly associated with the Gaitskellites of that era. People associated with Hugh Gaitskell, the Labour leader, but also Tony Crosland, the significant Labour MP, but also philosopher of socialism and a strong revisionist.
In a speech in Parliament in 1992, Smith said, "The second commandment calls upon us to love our neighbours as ourselves. I do not believe we can truly follow that great commandment unless we have a concept of concern for our fellow citizens, which is reflected in the organisation of our society." As Colm tells us, Smith was part of the party's liberal modernising wing.
He's a strong Christian socialist, so he was raised as a Presbyterian. I think he drew a lot of his politics from his interpretation of Christianity, and particularly emphasis on values like equality, fellowship. So it implied a more harmonious society. Him, socialism, like for Crosland, were those values, and how you manage to succeed in making those values work in modern society was the question for that tradition. Hence, they would believe that nationalisation may have worked in the 45 government, but wouldn't necessarily work in the 1970s or 1980s.
After graduating in 1963, Smith worked as a solicitor and then as a barrister. Having a legal background has been relatively common for post-war Labour leaders. Attlee, Blair, John Smith and Keir Starmer all qualified and worked as lawyers before becoming leader. I spoke to David Ward about the impact of Smith's legal career on his political life. Few people understand Smith's career as well as David, who served as his head of policy working closely with Smith from 1988 to 1994.
He was a very distinguished barrister and criminal lawyer, and I think it helped him in two ways. One is it gave him these incredibly forensic skills of being able to look at any policy area and really dissect it very clinically. And he worked in a very lawyerly sort of way. He used to have this distinctive thing of not wanting policies to be presented to him without all the negatives also being presented. He wanted to know what the downsides were. And if you presented something to him full of sort of optimism, this was a good idea, all he wanted to hear about was what was wrong with it. Because as a lawyer, you want to be able to defend your client the best by having the worst that's going to be thrown at you. So that was his approach. He was always very open to discussing policies in the round and listening to people's views, which I think was a big strength. Very self-confident person, but it gave him, he always knew there was something to fall back on if his political career went wrong.
Next, I spoke to Andy McSmith. Andy was Smith's only official biographer, publishing John Smith Playing the Long Game in 1993. He agrees that Smith was forensic.
When he presented the shadow budget as Shadow Chancellor, he knew every detail. There wasn't a single question anyone could ask him that he couldn't answer.
Let's hear from Colm Murphy again about how Smith's roots in Scottish law, rather than English law, influenced his political outlook, and particularly his interest in devolution. Devolution is the rebalancing of power, giving Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland stronger voices and stronger powers alongside Westminster, something which Smith became really tied to.
Shaped by the Scottish legal tradition, which is distinct from English legal structures. There's a sense in the Scottish tradition of a more European approach. So there's more skepticism of the die-hard parliamentary sovereignty line. The constitutional reformer, Anthony Barnett, once told me a story in an interview about seeing Smith speak at the Groucho Club, I think, which is like a very unusually cool place for Smith to be. But Smith was asked about something to do with constitutional reform and the English common law tradition and how far this is violating from this. And Smith answered, well, I'm Scottish, so immediately that's not as relevant for me necessarily as it is for you.
Smith stood unsuccessfully for Labour in 1961 and 64 before winning the Scottish seat of North Lanarkshire in 1970, aged 31, a seat he would keep for 24 years. Once elected, he rose quickly through the party.
I mean, he's quite unusual that he got elected in 1970 as an MP, and then after the 74 election, he was immediately promoted first as a PPS, Parliamentary Private Secretary, and then eventually Minister of State, eventually Cabinet Minister. So he spent most of the Wilson-Callaghan government in ministerial roles. So clearly they were impressed by him, and he must have learnt a lot. Particularly because it was a very challenging period for a Labour government. They went through a series of crises.
He worked with two Labour prime ministers serving in ministerial positions alongside them. So how did he view Wilson and Callaghan?
When I spoke to him about those two leaders, he certainly admired both of them in different ways. Both Wilson and Callaghan had their challenges, and I think he learnt a lot from that. So I think all of those things gave him close up the challenges of leadership under a lot of pressure.
For Wilson, Smith worked as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Energy, then Minister of State for Energy. And when Callaghan came in, he appointed Smith as Minister of State for the Privy Council and then Secretary of State for Trade. Smith became a big figure in the party and became one of the leading Scottish Labour MPs. It was at this time he became strongly devoted to the importance of devolution. This was pursued in the Callaghan years and ultimately failed, but became a big motivation for Smith throughout his political life.
He was given ministerial responsibility, which was particularly in energy, and then in devolution. He got involved in negotiating the oil exploration licenses for the North Sea, dealing with the major oil companies, the so-called Seven Sisters. And I think that was a very powerful experience for him, and rather optimistic. He was always commenting about the windfall that would come, did come from the North Sea oil revenues. Devolution, of course, failed. It ultimately brought down the Callaghan government, but it became his unfinished business. So there were definitely very formative years for him.
He is converted to devolution in this period while working on it, and that's very important given in the 90s he is one of the Labour politicians most strongly associated with the constitutional reform agenda, which leads to the really significant changes of the late 90s under New Labour.
When Labour went to the left under Michael Foot in the early 80s, Smith remained in the shadow cabinet, unlike many other MPs from his wing of the party. But, as Colm Murphy tells us, he decided to take less of a leading role.
When he did have to be a part of Michael Foot's Labour Party and defend it publicly, he chose his battles carefully. So publicly, he would talk mostly about unemployment, which is a unifying thing in the Labour Party, and unemployment was spiralling. So he could, denounce the Thatcherite economic agenda on those grounds and promise that Labour would do things differently, which they would. Internally, he would be very careful about policy. This is a bit niche, but it's important. He was the spokesperson for trade in 1981, I think. And at that point, Labour was developing a deeply protectionist, interventionist agenda there, following the Bennite alternative economic strategy logic. So massive import controls. Withdrawal from Europe was part of that, right? The immediate withdrawal without a referendum. Now, Smith obviously disagreed with this quite fundamentally as a pro-European, but in internal briefings he would choose his battles. So he would say, well, let's go for selective protection in particular industries rather than general protection. Let's consider negotiating with our European allies. Let's do X, let's do Y, let's do Z. So he was careful not to cause a public fight, and he probably suspected that this was all going to hit the fan as well.
So, how else did he approach working in the shadow cabinet during Foot's leadership?
He kept his head down. That was the main thing he did. In fact, there was some criticism of him for that. John Rentoul, the Blairite journalist, said he was, like a submarine in this period. Now, that's not quite fair.
When Foot resigned following the drastic defeat of 1983, as we heard in the previous episode, Neil Kinnock took over. Let's refresh our memories and hear from Neil on the intricacies of this moment and his view of why John Smith didn't stand for the leadership.
I knew I had to run. And I knew if I did run, the only candidate that would cause me any real difficulty would be Tony Benn if he was still a Member of Parliament. As it happens, he was defeated in his Bristol constituency. So my opponent inevitably was Roy Hattersley. I thought at one time it might be John Smith, but Hattersley's commitment to the party and its well-being was stronger than John's. And Roy's democratic socialist ideology was also deeper and more profound. So he was the natural candidate of the non-left, as it were.
Kinnock appointed John Smith as Shadow Chancellor 4 years into his leadership after the defeat of 1987. There were some positives from the election campaign, but confusion over tax was seen as having undermined Labour's economic credibility. Smith was tasked with working solidly on reinstating trust, and he was also chosen because of his position on the soft right, which helped balance Kinnock's leadership, who was still associated with the left. Let's look at the relationship between Smith and Kinnock.
They were very, very different people. And I think, people sometimes suggest that they were really at loggerheads. That wasn't my experience. I think there was a distance between them, which I think with hindsight probably wasn't that good in such senior positions. The relationship between the leader of the opposition and the Shadow Chancellor is really crucial. And so in a way, I think there was probably not enough communication between them. But actually, on a lot of the core issues, they were really quite closely aligned. John was famously pro-European and wanted Labour to be very active and engaged in European policymaking. Neil Kinnock had come to the exact same position. So there weren't really any major disputes around core policy areas.
There were incidences when clear tensions arose between Kinnock and Smith.
Famously there were difficulties that occurred over tax. One really notorious incident, so-called Luigi's Restaurant incident, which is where Neil, I think inadvertently, revealed some aspects of thinking about how we were going to handle particularly the national insurance issue in the tax proposals we had. And that caused real upset with John because it was all bursting across the newspapers and we weren't warned. We didn't know that this had happened. Afterwards, it was all sorted out, and Neil apologised to John, and John sort of took the apology, and we moved on. So there were a few what you might call communication issues like that.
However, David told me that Smith looked up to Kinnock for the efforts he had made in bringing order back to the Labour Party.
But I think a very important point is that Smith deeply admired Neil Kinnock and thought that he had been extremely brave when he took on and defeated the militant tendency in the mid-80s. He told me that he thought that was an act of great courage by Neil Kinnock, and it really entitled him unequivocally to hold the leadership of the Labour Party.
Let's hear from Andy McSmith on his view of Kinnock and Smith's relationship.
Smith thought that Kinnock wasn't really up to it. Kinnock felt that Smith wasn't loyal. They were very cross with him because at the time of the first Iraq War, Neil Kinnock was trying to get the Labour Party not to come out and oppose the war because there was a very strong anti-war element in the party. And he had a very difficult battle. And the Shadow Cabinet had a very tense session. And Kinnock's people complained afterwards that everybody at that Shadow meeting contributed except John Smith, who sat in silence and just let this thing go by.
Let's hear from Colm on why Smith was appointed as Shadow Chancellor in 1987.
Kinnock rewarded talent. He was a good leader in that respect. He was a significant force within the party. He represented an important strain within the party. So Roy Hattersley, I think, threatened to resign as deputy leader if Smith wasn't appointed Shadow Chancellor. So there's those kinds of calculations, factional calculations. So it's both a mixture of Smith being a capable politician with interest in the role, but also Kinnock's need to keep a coalition together. So it was tense, but it was professional. They worked well. They agreed on most things, actually. And one could say that Kinnock moved towards Smith on a number of issues. We could think about the European exchange rate mechanism, Europe more broadly. We could think about approaches to industrial policy. By the end of Kinnock's leadership, he was probably closer to Smith than he had been at the beginning of his leadership.
Smith worked really hard to rebuild Labour's credibility on the economy. Against the backdrop of Kinnock's policy review, his painstaking effort to modernise Labour by updating party positions. Smith was helped by the Thatcher government's introduction of the poll tax in 1989-90, a flat-rate charge for every adult that replaced an existing but progressive tax similar to today's council tax. The poll tax was deeply unpopular as it hit poorer households far harder than wealthier ones. Smith was able to present that the Conservatives were not the party of low taxation, and to Labour it seemed like this policy would finally be a step too far by the Thatcher government in the eyes of the public. But when John Major replaced Thatcher in November 1990, the poll tax was scrapped and Labour's momentum stalled. In the 1992 election campaign, in an attempt to clearly set out Labour's spending plans, Smith released the so-called shadow budget. It claimed that 8 out of 10 taxpayers would be better off under Labour's plans. But it backfired, and the Conservatives and right-wing media were able to frame it as a Labour tax bombshell, which dominated the first week of the campaign and undermined much of the progress that Smith had made in his years as Chancellor. Here's David and Colm.
The things was to try and make sure that we had a coherent economic policies and tax policy, and that led to what became the shadow budget. I think it's been rather misunderstood. What happened in the policy review, even though there was an effort to try and stop this happening, Labour racked up a whole load of quasi-pledges or indications of policy preference, which the Tories were then able to try and apply some kind of costings exercise to. And we didn't guard enough against that. The shadow budget was an attempt to shut down a process where we had really allowed ourselves to be laid open to that attack. And that's what the Tories did in 1991. They launched a campaign called Labour's Going for Broke Again and came out with figures from 28 billion and higher. The challenge we faced was how to handle that. So in some ways, the shadow budget was simply an inevitable consequence of dealing with how we were going to handle our commitments pre-election, and also push back against this claim that we had a whole raft of extra spending commitments, which we didn't.
Smith's shadow budget during the election was an attempt to neutralise that. I think it's fairly well established that it didn't fully succeed. But it was a very key moment in the 92 election, and it was a very formative moment for politicians around in that era, including Smith's colleagues like Blair and Brown and Beckett, but also younger figures like Yvette Cooper, who worked for John Smith.
Labour lost the 1992 election, their fourth consecutive election defeat, and John Major won with a huge proportion of the vote. Kinnock resigned as leader, and Smith was the forerunner to take over.
He'd established a very strong position as Shadow Chancellor, and as a trusted figure, as a popular figure across the Labour Party. He had strong support both amongst MPs, constituency Labour parties and trade unions. So I won't say any leadership election is easy, but he was just overwhelmingly favourite from day one. It was a bit of a shock for us to be thrown straight into a leadership campaign within a matter of days, just because you've been flat out for weeks in an election campaign, and a little bit of a breather would have been nice to have.
The only person to stand against Smith was Brian Gould. Born in New Zealand, he served as an MP from 1974 to 79, and again from 1983 to 1994.
Brian Gould's a really interesting figure, somebody not talked about as much anymore. Been around since the 1970s. He was from New Zealand originally. He was difficult to pin down factionally, which ended up being his undoing. When it came to the leadership election, he didn't have a robust coalition of support in the way that Smith did. By 92, his star has waned. So the interesting question is why? Why was Gould, who had been the coming man in the late 80s, so comprehensively destroyed in the 92 leadership election? I think Europe's a big factor. He was against the grain on that. Gould's lack of a robust factional support base really matters in the Labour Party. The third one is Smith was really associated with constitutional reform. Gould didn't oppose it, but Smith was the one associated with moves towards devolution, moves towards a Bill of Rights, of reshaping the British constitutional order in more liberal and more European directions. And that was seen by many people, again on the left and right of the party, as modern, as appropriate to the 90s, as the future strategy, as the future agenda. And that helped John Smith too.
John Smith won a huge landslide with 91% of the vote, the highest in the history of Labour leadership elections. He appointed Gordon Brown as his Shadow Chancellor, and Tony Blair as his Shadow Home Secretary. Let's hear from David Ward on what Smith aimed to do with the party.
He didn't want to massively change the trajectory that Neil Kinnock had set. In fact, some of the things were to complete, if you like, Neil Kinnock's unfinished business. So he was committed to completing the internal reforms of the Labour Party, reforming the links with unions and so on. I think where he wanted to take things a bit further forward was, and put his own stamp on things, was around democratic reform and constitutional reform. And that he made his own leadership signature. And that, of course, was dating back partly to the unfinished business of devolution that he'd worked on in the Callaghan government.
Smith had a huge win early on, in September 1992, on what became known as Black Wednesday. The Conservative government under John Major had staked its reputation on keeping the pound within the European exchange rate mechanism, the ERM. But as speculators attacked the currency, the government burnt through billions in reserves trying to defend it, and failed. The pound crashed, interest rates spiked twice in one day, and by the evening the UK had been forced out of the ERM entirely. This shattered Major's reputation, and in Smith's debut Commons speech as Labour leader, he dismissed Major as the devalued Prime Minister of a devalued government. By October, Labour had a huge 22-point poll lead over the Conservatives, and remained ahead of them all the way up to the 1997 election. Labour looked like they were guaranteed to win the next election, and Smith continued to try to make sure that the left and right were united.
It was helped a great deal by the fact that Neil Kinnock had fought so many battles. Smith didn't have to fight many factional battles. He fought this big one over the bloc vote.
Smith wanted to democratise the party by replacing the bloc vote, where trade unions had disproportionate numbers of votes in selecting parliamentary candidates and party leaders, with a one-member, one-vote system. Smith struggled more than Kinnock had to maintain good relations with the unions. For Kinnock, Charles Clarke, his chief of staff, who we heard from in the last episode, was a key point of contact for senior union officials, whereas Smith didn't really have anyone in his office who fulfilled that role. He narrowly achieved the change to one member, one vote in 1993.
To the annoyance of the Blairites, they wanted it done in 1992 straight away. And Smith held back because he thought he'd wait until he was pretty sure he could get it through. So he did it in 93. And his attitude was, after that, I remember him saying to me, "We've had enough drama, we don't want any more." So he wasn't looking for any more factional battles after that.
It was Will, the editor of this podcast, that spoke to the next guest, Kevin Hickson, prominent Labour Party historian and senior lecturer in British political history at Liverpool University. Let's hear from him on Smith's approach to factionalism.
John realised the party was very factional, and I think John's great quality was being able to try to unite the party. The Kinnock years had certainly been divisive, and John was more the healer, really, and was quite happy in the company of the left. The left seemed quite happy with John, even though he was a figure of the right, in a way, strangely, perhaps, that they weren't with Neil Kinnock, who started off as a figure of the left. But they were much happier with John.
Once Tony Blair took over, there would become a huge emphasis placed on media management. But Smith took a different view. Here's David Ward.
New Labour had what you'd call a really active, non-stop engagement with the media. They felt that you had to be selling a message the whole time. And John had a rather different view. And people say, oh, he was old-fashioned. I think that he was quite old-fashioned in this sense. He didn't think you should be pursuing a daily media agenda. You should actually even be prepared to be quiet some of the time. Better to be noticed when you do speak. This idea of keeping your powder dry was something that he took quite seriously. When you're leader of the opposition, daily pressure of commenting on things is huge. But nevertheless, he didn't want to get trapped in this sort of, a bit like a hamster on a wheel, constantly commenting on stuff. And that's why he didn't really follow the sort of media management techniques favoured, for example, by Peter Mandelson.
Smith was funny and a great performer in the Commons, and he was most commonly compared in the media to a trusty bank manager.
Affable, he got on well with a lot of them, and that was a good advantage for him, because he was a very likeable man. So I think he built up quite good relations with the lobby and so on. I don't think he was as fearful as some in New Labour became. And he had not had the kind of treatment that Neil Kinnock got. Maybe by the time of the election, if he'd lived, he would have, and that might have affected his views. But that hadn't happened to him. And it's back to his inner self-confidence. A man of great inner tranquility, if you like, and sure in his own skin.
As David tells us, it's likely that had Smith become Prime Minister, Labour wouldn't have become so close to the tabloid press, and probably wouldn't have taken the controversial moves that Blair and his press secretary Alistair Campbell took in courting their support.
So I think that as a result of that, I don't think he would have gone out of his way to court the Murdoch press. I mean, flying down to Australia to appear on the back of a yacht or 10 parties or whatever it was that Blair did, I don't think he would have ever dreamed of doing that. In a way, the age he was in a slightly more innocent age. This is pre-internet. It's hard for people to think about now, but we barely got into emails at the time that he died. Media management was very different. It wasn't so instantaneous as it is now. But I don't think he would have turned it into quite the elephant in the room that others have. But I think that was very much of his time. I'm not sure that, if you could reimagine a world where he was around today, I think he would have had to adapt his style quite a bit, as all politicians have had to.
As leader, Smith championed the national minimum wage, the adoption of the Freedom of Information Act, and continued to push for devolution in Wales and Scotland, something he'd been determinedly in favour of since the 70s. He also really championed Britain's relationship with Europe and female representation in the Commons. He introduced all-women shortlists for the Labour Party in 1993, helping many more women to be elected in safe seats. These were many of the original policies of many of the liberal reforms that are associated with Blair's governments. Under Smith, Labour seemed to be in incredibly capable hands, and finally looked like a serious government in waiting. Smith himself was personally popular, seen as principled, competent and trustworthy, and he had an attractive team in the shadow cabinet, including Blair and Brown. On the 11th of May 1994, he made a speech at a Labour fundraising event. He closed the speech by saying, "The opportunity to serve our country, that is all we ask." The next day, on the 12th of May 1994, Smith died suddenly of a heart attack, aged 55.
I do remember on the day he died, there somehow seemed to be a certainty in public mind that he was going to be Prime Minister. I don't know why, but suddenly, the minute he was dead, it sort of gelled. That guy was going to win the election. And I do remember the front page lead of The Sun. The opening words were, "Britain's next Prime Minister died yesterday." So even The Sun acknowledged that he was going to win. People were just shocked by it. The Scottish Conservative Party was having a conference at the time, and it was announced, and the camera caught the look of shock on people's faces. In the Labour Party, there was this terrible feeling that they'd just lost somebody they were fond of.
David Ward remembers a conversation he'd had with Smith about who Smith thought would eventually take over from him as leader.
On the Monday before he died, and he'd come into the office, and we were slightly worried about his health at the time, and he'd had a very heavy schedule of travelling, and there was some reference that I made to looking after himself, and then he said, if something happened to me, who would take over? And before I could answer, he said, "It's got to be Tony." And I agreed with him. He mentioned Tony's ability he said, turn on a sixpence. He's so agile on policy and other issues.
Obviously, the rivalry between Blair and Brown about who should be the next leader was something that would go on to cause tension between them for a very long time. As David says, his discussion with Smith about his successor wasn't necessarily a definitive one.
A nuance you can put on this, which is that's who he thought would be the leader, not necessarily who should be the leader. And so if you're someone from a Gordon Brown camp, you'd say, well, he's just not necessarily endorsing Tony, he's just assuming that Tony was somehow in front of Gordon Brown. I do think he was prone to think that Tony was in pole position. For the reason that he mentioned. But it is a matter of record, that's what he told me.
Let's look more at the reaction to Smith's death and the consequences of it. I spoke to Conservative historian Peter Dorey about the Conservative Party's reaction, as well as to Colm Murphy and Kevin Hickson.
The Conservative Party, respect and admired him much, much more than they did Michael Foot or Neil Kinnock. I think John Smith basically was widely respected almost across the political spectrum. He was seen as a decent, down-to-earth man with good values. And I think actually when he sort of died suddenly, I think many Conservatives actually were quite shocked and saddened.
One of the reasons why there's a saintly mythology about Smith, which is partially grounded in truth, is because of the tragedy of his death. And it was a tragedy. All we ask is to serve. Gives it this aura of what if. And yes, he was clearly well liked. He had few enemies. But the other reason there was that outpouring is because of the shock of it, I think.
And who knows, ultimately what would have happened if he'd lived. Presumably he would have won the 97 election, I think, still pretty comfortably. Maybe not with as big a majority as Tony Blair, but enough to govern for 2 full terms. And he would have been more radical, I think, in certain policy areas than Blair was. He was more committed to traditional democratic socialist principles. I think that, an aim of policy would have been to reduce the gap between the richest and the poorest, which is ultimately the big failure in domestic policy of the Blair years, as Blair himself admitted after he left office, that the gap between the richest and the poorest had widened dramatically during the Thatcher major years, and Blair ultimately failed to reduce it. I think there would have been much more effort, much more focus on that.
Now, let's look in detail at Smith's legacy. Here's David.
Today, when you look at the politics of the UK, it's completely transformed by Welsh and Scottish devolution and those kind of reforms. It's changed entirely the geography of our political discussion. Well, that's a large measure down to him. The minimum wage has been described just recently by the Resolution Foundation as the most successful economic policy of the last 25 years. Well, he's not the only person associated with it, but he was a really big champion of it. And you can sort of say without him, we wouldn't have it the way that we do. So these are big achievements. If you look today, there's a wonderful video films, mainly on C-SPAN, of John Smith speaking in Parliament. And it's very entertaining because sometimes he's really, really funny. But one of the striking things, you look at the benches and you look at how dominantly male they are. It's extraordinary. That has been transformed. And the starting point of that transformation was all women shortlists agreed in 1993. And a lot of particularly leading female MPs now say that their chance of getting selected was entirely due to that.
One issue of debate that has emerged about Smith's legacy is the accusation, mainly from New Labour reformers that came after him, that Smith was too cautious and believed that one more heave of using old methods would bring Labour to power. Roy Hattersley refuted this in 2004, saying, "The idea that John Smith, with no more original idea than one more heave, would have lost the 1997 election was assiduously fostered by the more disreputable supporters of the project, meaning New Labour. They hoped that by diminishing the old Labour leader, they would exalt the new." Let's hear from David.
A number of things I've written, I've described him as cat-like, that actually quite capable of making very bold jumps. But he always wanted to make sure that what he was going to land on would take the strain of the jump. And that's what he was like. And so it goes back to this criticism of one more heave. The one more heave thing implies that you literally just sit there waiting for the election to fall into your lap. I mean, that's just absurd. He wasn't doing that at all. And everything you can see happened in those 22 months contradicts the idea that he was just waiting for the keys to number 10 to fall into his lap. Just nonsense, actually.
Now, let's hear from Colm Murphy on Smith's legacy, as well as his view of the one more heave debate.
There was, Smith wasn't alone in leaving this legacy, but he was very significant in doing so. The attachments among the broader liberal left towards progressive unionism, to use Leighton Andrews' terms, so that it's a Labour-like position that you support the union, but you support devolution in order to solidify the union, as opposed to muscular unionism of more recent Conservative governments. That kind of broad approach, the approach that Gordon Brown took during the referendum, and Alistair Darling as well, I think that is developed by a lot of authors, but Smith is very much among them and high, and it's his leadership that you really see that kind of perspective on the union and the constitution embed itself within the Labour Party in a way that it wasn't in previous eras. And I would say a similar thing about social Europe and instinctive pro-Europeanism. It was changing under Kinnock, and Kinnock is a key part of the story, but Smith really seals the deal. Is there anything that's misleading? Well, I talked about the saintly aura. I think the tragedy of his death and the controversies of what followed means that some things are forgotten, his tough approach to macroeconomics, and the fact also that, as we began this podcast by discussing, Labour face really difficult structural barriers. There would have been things. We don't, it would be speculation to go into more detail than that, but the Smith governments would have had problems because Labour governments have problems. So that's the one thing I would pick out as a problem. The other thing, though, is the one more heave New Labour mythology, which I see is less significant than it used to be, but there are still purveyors of it among a certain generation of opinion columnists, and it is misleading. The idea that it was only New Labour that did these things, that is inaccurate, and that is a discredit to Smith and to many other people too.
Thanks so much for listening to this Leading Labour episode on John Smith. Today we heard from Colm Murphy, David Ward, Andy McSmith, Neil Kinnock, Kevin Hickson and Peter Dorey. The links to read more about them, as well as links to buy their brilliant books, are in the description of this episode. Next week will be the beginning of our 3-part series on one of the most electorally successful but most divisive Labour leaders, Tony Blair. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes, and do leave us a rating if you've been enjoying the series. This episode was research presented and produced by me, Izzy Conn. Special thanks goes to Will Barber-Taylor for editing and additional research. The artwork for this episode is by Miranda Reed. Music is by Rickard Fromm.